Due to the shortness of time here, I'm going to try to get started. Usually I try to give a few minutes. But what a beautiful way to go into such a festive week, learning Torah together. Once again, can't say enough about what the SCA has been putting together in these amazing days of inspiration. I want to say that today's class and today's Tanach study, the Day of Learning as a whole, is sponsored in memory of Mr. Stanley Chera A by the Chera Family. Okay, so as a bit of a disclaimer, before I begin, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Just want to make sure everybody can. Okay, great. So the topic today was the Satmar versus Rav Kook and their perspectives on Medinat Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael. I want to, as a short disclaimer, just say that even just to discuss the Satmar and his position in his book, the Yahel Moshe, alone, and if I had an hour or 5 hours, I probably couldn't do it justice. And the same could be said for Rav Kook and his positions on Eretz Yisrael, Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, and so on. Certainly not discussing both of them in about 25 minutes. So what are our goals today? I'm really going to just try and touch on a few points of focus that each of them have in their work so that we could get a little bit of an appreciation for their perspectives on the last 72 years of history and what Eretz Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael mean to each of them. Start off with a little bit of history. The Satmar Rav's name is Rav Yoel Teitelbaum. He and Rav Kook did not live at the same time period exactly. They're about 40 years apart. Rav Yoel Teitelbaum passed away in the year 1979. Rav Kook passed away in the year 1935. So as much as we're going to be discussing them side by side today, they never actually spoke or met in their time periods. Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, he's a Holocaust survivor. In fact, he was rescued in 1944, ironically, by the Zionist movement. And he actually ended up in Yerushalayim for about a year or two, and then ended up in Williamsburg, eventually naming his community Kiryat Yoel, where he stayed. He did go to visit his Talmidim in Eretz Yisrael every so often, but that's where he settled. And Rav Kook, of course, we know his whereabouts. Around the year 1955, Rav Yoel Teitelbaum published his magnus opus, known as the Yahel Moshe, which is the very big book that he wrote about his beliefs about Medinat Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. And that becomes the focus of his writings and what he became very famous for. Just to be fully transparent, you're going to hear some of these opinions today. We're going to read some of them. Some of them are going to be a little hard to read, especially considering our own beliefs. Some of them might even be considered to be offensive. I'm going to, just for the other side of it, I want to mention that the Gedolim in general, outside of Rav Yoel Teitelbaum's opinions in this particular area, hold of him as one of our giants in the Gedolim, in the world of the Gedolim. He's really, considered an Ohev Yisrael and so on. Of course, this in particular became an obsession of his of sorts and became what he was most known for. But just to be clear, also Rav Neria, and with this I'll end in the introduction, Rav Neria, who's one of the 5 prominent students of Rav Kook, used to tell his students that anybody who wants to call themselves a religious Zionist must know the Yahel Moshe inside and out. And so that just tells you a little bit about the magnitude in which his work was considered. And I'll tell you that every time I open it up, I really get sucked in. You really want to get to know it, and you want to know the arguments back and forth. Okay, with that, I want to dive in. So I will screen share my Daf Mekorot. 1 second here. But I'm also going to go back and forth. I found this to be particularly challenging for me this year because there's just so much that you can learn about together and talk about, but I tried to really, again, get the broad strokes. So the first premise that Rav Yoel Teitelbaum works off of is the Gemara in the end of Masechet Ketubot that talks about the Gimel Shvuot, the 3 oaths, not to be confused with 3 weeks, right? Shavua, Shavuot. No, we're talking about oaths They come from Shir HaShirim, right? It says Hishbati etchem, right? The word Hishbati is said 3 times. These are the 3 oaths. And the Gemara reads, Achat, if you see the green, you'll see over here, Achat shelo ya'alu Yisrael bechoma, ve'achat shishbi'a HaKadosh Baruch Hu et Yisrael shelo yimrudu be'umot ha'olam, ve'achat shishbi'a HaKadosh Baruch Hu et ha'ovdei kochavim shelo yishtabdu behen be'Yisrael yoter midai. So there are 3 oaths here, right? The first being that we're not to ascend to the land of Israel kind of like en masse, like you're not supposed to come together as a nation as opposed to going one at a time. The second is that we should not rebel against the other nations when we're in galut, when we're in exile. And the third is that if you afflict the Jews in this unacceptable way, then it's kind of a warning to the non-Jews, to the non-Jewish lands and governments, that then there's going to be a consequence for them. So as you see here in this Gemara, one of the oaths is that we're not allowed to come back to the land of Israel. And the question is, what is the premise of this and how does this work on the halachic basis? But from here, the Satmar really bases most of his writings, and he really, again, a proliferation of other sources that he brings to elaborate on this point. I really tried to find just something that could give a little bit of a flavor from the Vayol Moshe. This flavor comes from one of his most uncomfortable points, which is that he felt very strongly that the Holocaust, the Shoah, was a result of the Zionist movement. It was Hashem's response, because the Gemara goes on to say that if we do come back, if we do try to have a Zionist movement and come back to the land of Israel, boy, will there be a price to pay. And that price is going to come, in the form of mass deaths and murders and so on. So he writes over here, we don't have to look so far to know what sin it was that brought this great tragedy onto us. Because the rabbis tell us very clearly that because we have these oaths and one of them tells us that we're not allowed to come back, we're not allowed to make a movement to come back and try to take over the land. Your flesh will be like the beasts of the fields. And unfortunately, in our sins, we have the minim and aprikosim. That's what he calls the not religious Jews. Unfortunately, that we're trying to do a secular movement, to begin a secular movement back to Yisrael, because of all the hishtadut that they did. That is what led to the Holocaust. Of course, a very, very troubling perspective, but again, this is one of his very strong beliefs, and he brings other midrashim, and he brings a maharal, and he brings other things that to support his view in this area. So there's a fabulous book that has been written. Unfortunately, it's a new book, and therefore it's hard to find online. But Rav Shlomo Aviner wrote a book called Alon Na'aleh. And if you could see the cover of it, the book Alon Na'aleh, you see that he highlights the Gemara with the 3 oaths. And the entire book here is a response to the Vayol Moshe. Rav Shlomo Aviner, of course, is one of the students of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the son of Rav Kook. And he spends the entire book over here really breaking down all sorts of arguments against each part that he could bring. And I don't think he covers the whole Vayol Moshe, but he does a lot. One, for example, the very first one in the chapter that he dives into is it's a Gemara. You're right. Vayol Moshe, there's a Gemara of these 3 oaths. But why aren't you dealing with the fact that not one of our Rishonim, not the Rambam, not Rashi, not the Ramban, not one of the great halachic authorities of our time period mentions this lehalacha, right? We have different type of midrashim. We have midrashei Agadah and we have midrashei halacha. And not one of the authorities that we have mentioned this lehalacha. The Rambam in his Mishneh Torah mentions almost every Gemara that you could possibly imagine if they're lehalacha. And yet, of course, he does not mention these 3 oaths in that way. I summarized a few of his arguments over here, some of the primary ones. In source number 3, the Avnei Nezer, again, a halachic giant, writes that one of the ways that we're able to get past these 3 oaths was if we have the permission of the world, right? If the non-Jewish world is to allow for us to go back to the land of Israel, then it's no longer considered rebelling against the non-Jewish world. And therefore, he saw the Balfour Declaration as the world voting on our right to move back. And he said that effectively, and many of the poskim at the time saw the Balfour Declaration as not just a historical moment, but one that had significant halachic ramifications. That once the world kind of gave us the sense, the confidence that they are behind us having our country, then that really was like the last symbol we needed to know that Hashem was on our side and opening the doors for us to come back. And that was from the Avnei Nezer. I will say that along with that, he mentions a few other examples over here, but there's another book written about Gush Katif and what happened then. But a lot of the symbols that Hashem gives in the Gemara about how when Hashem took us out, when he kicked us out in the time period of Yirmiyahu, the land would be desolate and nothing would be able to grow. And you see pictures, you see satellite images of all the years that the Muslim countries were in charge, and even the Turks were in charge. And really, there was no vegetation, there was no greenery, there was no sprouting. But as soon as we came back, Be'emet, you see tremendous. And Gush Katif was like the epitome of that. It said that it grew 6 times faster than the next fastest area in the entire world. So he brings a whole list of proofs as to why and how we know that this is no longer around. One of them, of course, is also Rashi on this Gemara, where Rashi again says that this is a Midrash Haggadah. It says Biyad Chazakah. What is the Biyad Chazakah? Not in an armed force. In other words, you're allowed to come back to Eretz Yisrael. But even before this, even before the Balfour Declaration, he's saying this is not halachic. This is about, we don't do this as a group yet. But if Rashi, his point is that if Rashi were to believe that this had any halachic ramifications, then of course he would have discussed them then. Lastly, I'll say that the Meshech Chochmah, Rav Meir Simcha Midevinsk, he held that the 3 oaths had the third oath is a response to the first 2. So he held that when you look at the 3 oaths, it says that if the people, if their belief, if the non-Jewish countries are to mistreat the Jewish people, then the first 2 oaths are off, right? If the non-Jews go against the Jews and they don't treat us appropriately, then of course this whole deal is off. And he said that the Holocaust was really, the obvious showing to us that we are no longer able to have these 3 oaths are no longer relevant. Okay, so with that, I'll say that was essentially a quick summary of some of the points, but I want to just give basically the 4 beliefs of the Satmar Rav, right? The 4 beliefs are that 1 is that only divine intervention can bring the Am Yisrael back to Eretz Yisrael, right? That's not something that could be brought back by us, by humans. Only Hashem could do that. And how is he to do that? Belief number 2 is that that's to happen through the Mashiach. Right? Only the Melech HaMashiach could come and tell us that we are going to be back in Eretz Yisrael. The second is that the process in order to do that is through the process of teshuvah. Right? There has to be some type of teshuvah process that has to lead to coming back to Eretz Yisrael. And that was a fundamental belief of his. And then third is that the state has to be a theocracy, right? He believed, of course, that the state had to be something that was purely religious and couldn't be secular. And therefore, the fourth is that everybody had to live an observant lifestyle. So these are really the fundamental beliefs of the Satmar Rav. I'm just going to give a little bit of a context here for actually a different opinion. If you've heard of him, his name is the Eim HaBanim Smecha. If you've heard of the Eim HaBanim Smecha, give a thumbs up. Have you heard of the Eim HaBanim Smecha? Rav Shlomo Teichtel. So Rav Shlomo Teichtel was another rabbi who lived in the time period of the Shoah. Unfortunately, first of all, if you don't have the book, I strongly advise you getting the Sefer, the Eim HaBanim Smecha. He wrote the entire book in the Shoah. He actually writes in one of his 3 introductions to the Sefer, he constantly apologizes for not having Sfarim. He had no books with him in the ghettos. And so every source that he gives, he apologizes after saying, I may not have quoted this right, and I apologize because I don't have the sources. I think the students counted that there's over something like 3,000 sources in the book. And of course, not one word, not one letter is misquoted in the entire Tanach and all the Gemara and all the Poskim. And the Eim HaBanim Smecha, Rav Shlomo Teichtel was one of the leading Haredi rabbis going into the Shoah. And at some point during the Holocaust, he had a transformation, an intellectual transformation, where he realized that everything was about Eretz Yisrael. And he began to give all of his speeches about Eretz Yisrael. And he ended up writing this book, and he writes such a beautiful letter at the beginning of the book. He makes a neder to Hashem, and he tells him, he writes that if you only save me from this Shoah, I'll release this book. And they didn't find this book for many years. They found it dug many years later. They didn't even find it for a while. They found this manuscript after, and we found out that he was killed in the last week of the Shoah, Shem Yikom Damo. And Rav Shlomo Teichtel writes in his book just the opposite of the Satmar Rav. He says that the Holocaust happened because of the people that were fighting the Tkumat Hamdina, that those that were trying to bring back Medinat Yisrael, that those who were trying to bring back Am Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael were the ones who were going to save us from this, and that our fight against it is the reason why. So it's interesting how they have these two very different perspectives. But again, I strongly advise if you didn't have the book Eim HaBanim Smecha, it's a very powerful book, a very powerful sefer. So with that, I'm going to transition a little bit to that of Rav Kook and the philosophy of Rav Kook. Does anybody want to have any hands? I don't see any hands raised. It's very hard. We're doing the Zoom version of this. If you have any questions, feel free. If not, I'm going to continue with Rav Kook. So Rav Kook has a very interesting passage. The Gemara, again, one of the famous statements that we have about Eretz Yisrael, we find in the Gemara in Bava Batra, and Kuf Nun Chet. I'm not going to get into the Gemara again out of sensitivity to our time, but right here at the bottom, it tells us a very interesting fundamental belief that we have about Eretz Yisrael, and that is that Avira de Eretz Yisrael machkima, or machkim in the Gemara. What does that mean? It means somehow the air of Eretz Yisrael, the atmosphere of Eretz Yisrael, somehow raises the level of chokhmah. What does that mean? I have a Tanach, I open it up in Yerushalayim, I open it up in Brooklyn. What's the difference? The words are the same. Since when does the location change the level of my intellect? Since when does it impact my ability to learn? It's a very hard Gemara to understand. How are we supposed to understand this concept of chokhmah and why the location, why being in Eretz Yisrael somehow is supposed to elevate our chokhmah? Rav Kook has a beautiful piece where he talks about the idea that the word chacham and the word chayim are the same gematria, right? Chacham and chayim are the same gematria. And he explains that as in Eretz Yisrael, the chokhmah and the chayim are not allowed to be separated. They can't be separated. That's part of the teva of Eretz Yisrael. That means that our intellect, our wisdom, our knowledge is our life, right? They are one. Haba hataya. They are connected. What does that mean? There's no fancy, I'm just going to sit here and learn, and we're going to have a nice shiur on Zoom, and then we're going to close our laptops, and then we're going to go on with our lives. There's no such thing. The Avira de Eretz Yisrael is this ability that I have to understand as a Jew in Eretz Yisrael, that everything I learn is what I live, and that there's no separation between those two. As the Rambam writes, Tacho Kevaro, everything I am inside is what I speak, and everything I speak is what I am. That's the Avira de Eretz Yisrael. As he writes over there beautifully, Pia Patcha Bechochma. We say in Eshet Chayil every Friday night. What is Pia Patcha Bechochma? We think we're just talking about this woman who's just some intelligent woman. No, he says Pia Patcha Bechochma. Her chochma, her wisdom was her life. It's how she lived. Her chesed was her Torah. How she acted, how she carried out her chochma in her chayim. Those were one. Those were inseparable. Rav Kook writes at length there that is the chidush of Eretz Yisrael. There's no separation between the guf and the neshama. The guf and the neshama are one. That's a big chidush. That's a big chidush of Eretz Yisrael. The land and the neshama of the place are both kedushat haaretz. They're both purely holy. What does that mean? I look outside right now to my backyard. I don't have shmita. I don't have orla. There's no concept that this land has any holiness to it. There's no sanctity to the land here. There's a complete disconnect between the guf of this place that I live in and the neshama of it. But in Eretz Yisrael, the land itself has a built-in kedusha. He brings a wonderful Bach, the Beit Chadash on the Shulchan Aruch, who says a wonderful question on the bracha of Al HaMechiyah. He says, "V'ha'aleinu letocha v'samchinu b'vinina v'nochal miperya." You ever think about those words? We're going to go into this land of Eretz Yisrael, to this holy, holy land, Then we're going to go up into the binyan, into the Beit HaMikdash. And what's the highest level above the Beit HaMikdash? V'nochal mi pirya. We're gonna eat a clementina, right? What does that mean? Above the Beit HaMikdash is this eating of the perot of Eretz Yisrael. He says yes, because above the kedusha of the ruach of the neshama of the Beit HaMikdash is the ability to show that the physicality of Eretz Yisrael in the spirit of Eretz Yisrael are chadhu, are one. That Hashem is showing the kedusha of the land of Eretz Yisrael is the fact that the guf and the neshama are one, which is why we actually have a halacha, right? We were talking about Leilui Nishmat Stanley Chera. We're seeing a lot of this today, but we have this mitzvah when somebody passes away, that when the bones, when God forbid after the Shoshim, sometimes you have a burial here, and sometimes people take the bones and then they move them to Eretz Yisrael. Why do they do that? Why do they move the bones to Eretz Yisrael? He lived his whole life here. Why not leave him here? It says, the Gemara says, take the bones, take the goof. Show the goof that the kedusha, whatever's left of the kedusha, there's no kedusha to the land here. Bring it over there where the goof could have an actual connection to the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, so that his neshama can have an aliyah nitzchit. Says Rav Kook, this is the depth of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is found in this deep connection between who we are inside, who our neshama is, and how we live and how we carry out our chayim. My father just told me a powerful story. He said that he was given a great zchut 100 years ago, or actually now a little more than 100 years ago. Rav Kook took a famous tour with Rav Sonnenfeld. If you know Rav Sonnenfeld, he was like the prime adversary of Rav Kook in many ways, and people always thought of them as enemies. People didn't realize that although they had disagreements in Torah, they were very, very close. They were in fact very close. In fact, one of the times the students of Rav Sonnenfeld asked him, if we had the Beit HaMikdash today, who would be the Kohen Gadol? And he looked at them in awe, in shock. So what do you mean who would be the Kohen Gadol? And he said, well, who would it be? Who would be the biggest Kadosh? And he said, of course it's Rav Kook. And he said, you're going to tell us Rav Kook out of everything that you guys have been saying? He said, all of our machlokot are l'shem shamayim, they're all about Torah. But once the Mashiach comes, Eliyahu is going to come and tell us the truth. The Beit HaMikdash is coming to tell you who the biggest Kadosh is. There's no question that Rav Kook is on the highest level. And people didn't always, unfortunately, populate those stories. But one of the very famous things that happened between Rav Kook and Rav Sonnenfeld is Rav Kook told him that he wants him to come with him on a tour of all the kibbutzim. Rav Kook was known for going to the kibbutzim because he wanted to help everybody. He was a bit of a kiruv rabbi, and he used to leave the Beit HaMidrash, and he used to go. And Rav Sonnenfeld told him, that's your thing. You like to go to the kibbutzim. I stay in the Beit Midrash. You go for you. And Rav Kook said, absolutely not. If we're going to make any progress in helping this new nation understand that we have achdut, they need to see us walk together. If you're not coming with me, I'm not going to come. And Rav Sonnenfeld ended up saying, okay, and he agreed. And they did something called Masa HaMoshavot. And they went around, and there's this tour that they took for a long time, and they went to different moshavot, to different kibbutzim, and they tried to do kiruv. And to celebrate the 100 years, to the anniversary of the 100 years of that Masa, they invited 100 rabbis from around the country of Israel to do the tour with them and to go to each one. And it was a very interactive. My father was invited as one of the 100 rabbis, and I asked him to tell me something that he learned there, and I'll leave you with this. He said that they got to a kibbutz, and they met a man who was about 101 years old, something along those lines. And he said that he remembers when Rav Kook and Rav Sonnenfeld came to their moshav, to their kibbutz. And he said that when they showed up, it was Erev Shabbat. It was right before Shabbat, and they had asked if they could come for Shabbat. And it wasn't just a not religious kibbutz, it was an anti-religious kibbutz. It was a kibbutz that, this was not a simple project, and they were coming to spend Shabbat. And there was some discussion there at the gate as to, where they're coming and they want to come. And then this man comes on his horse, Erev Shabbat. He comes with his horse, and he says, we don't want you here. He says to Rav Kook, and Rav Kook says, why? What do you mean? What do we do? He says, Batem lehashpia aleinu. He says, you came here to brainwash us. You think we don't know your shtick? You came here to brainwash us. We're not interested in your brainwash. And Rav Kook looks back at him, and he says, he'll never forget these words. He says, Lo banu lehashpia alechem, ela banu liyot mushpa'im mikem. He said, we didn't come here to brainwash you. We came here to learn from you. He says, well, what do you mean? What do you come here to learn from me? He says, I have a Beit Midrash with 1,000 Bachrim in the middle of Yerushalayim learning every single day about Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, he told them. I'm translating to English. He says, I have 1,000 of them learning about Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, and not one of them even begins to understand how much you know about the Kedusha of the land. Not one of them has planted the orchards that I see behind you. Not one of them has worked the land like you've worked them. You live the Torah every day. You're not just taking the chokhmah, but you're connecting the guf and the neshama. And he says he'll never forget it. He came off of his horse and he walked up to Rav Kook and he said, Shalom Aleichem, right? The beginning of Kabbalat Shabbat. And he said that Rav Kook and Rav Sonnenfeld came that Shabbat into the Moshav. They spent Shabbat. And after Shabbat, he'll never forget this as a kid. The entire Moshav went into the kitchen, and Rav Kook and Rav Sonnenfeld koshered the entire kitchen. They made it kasher. He said, until this day, the kitchen is koshered from Rav Kook and Rav Sonnenfeld with their private hashgacha. Very powerful story. But one of the many stories that speaks to the belief, the very deep belief of Rav Kook in this deep connection between the land and the Torah. That the depths of the guf and the neshama that you live in, he actually writes a beautiful piece about this. He says, and it could even extend beyond the borders of Eretz Yisrael. It could even extend beyond the borders of Eretz Yisrael. He says that a person living outside of Eretz Yisrael, if he dedicates himself to not just learn for the sake of learning, which is a beautiful thing to learn for the sake of learning, but to look for how, as soon as he closes the sefer, as soon as he closes the laptop, as soon as he closes whatever he's doing, to look for how he can apply it, he or she can apply it in their lives, to see how he could live it. That is Avira de Eretz Yisrael. That's how you get a little bit, he calls it a tzinor. It's a little bit of a pipe that connects you to Eretz Yisrael. The person who knows how to apply their Torah, to say it's not just this nice idea, it's not just a nice speech, but it's something that I'm going to apply in my life, that I'm going to find right away how I could bring into my life. He calls that Avira de Eretz Yisrael. Bezrat Hashem, we should learn from all of our giants. Bezrat Hashem, we should all, Bezrat Hashem, be back in Eretz Yisrael where we can together recite the Hallel of Yom HaAtzmaut, Bezrat Hashem, at the Kotel, with no quarantine and no seclusion, but Bezrat Hashem loud with the Shofar Gadoli Taka. And we're looking Bezrat Hashem for the Biat Mashiach Tzidkenu B'mera B'yameinu Amen. Kol Tuv.
Rabbi, done very well, Rabbi. Jesse Stanley speaking.
Thank you. Were there any questions?
Very well.
I didn't ask if there are any questions. I just feel bad about going late.
Great class, Rabbi. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I appreciate it.
Of course. Kol Tuv.